Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So without more ado, let me welcome today's speaker, the Revd Dr David Wilkinson, who is the principal of St John's College in Durham, and he's also a lecturer in theology and science in the Department of Theology. And Dr Wilkinson is actually an astrophysicist by background, and then went into theology. He's been involved in the science-religion discussion over a period of many years. Has also been quite involved in writing books, popular books, heavyweight books, and also with the media. And he's telling me that he has an article coming out in the Times Literary Supplement.
It's just an interview
coming out this week and so forth. So he's very much involved in the public domain in this topic. And today he's going to speak to us on the eschatology and the future of the universe. So thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Immense privilege to be here. I'm really excited at the work that's being done here through Faraday, and to be asked to take part in these research seminars and be able to be here. I'm grateful. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research work that I've been doing, which is in the area of Christian eschatology and the end of the universe. Although I'm always somewhat hesitant about talking about the future. In an interview, one footballer once said, "I never make predictions and I never will." You've just got to think about that for a moment or two and see what profound philosophy it is. And yet at the same time, questions about the future are of interest to scientists and theologians, and perhaps have not been explored as much as they could have been within the science-religion dialogue. John Polkinghorne, of course, here has done some of the initial work in the area, but there's still a great deal that we can look at. Let me just give you one or two quotes to set the scene before I go into the topic as a whole. Bertrand Russell: "The world which science presents for our belief is even more purposeless, more void of meaning. All the labours of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins." Or Paul Davis, talking about the future of the universe: "An almost empty universe growing steadily more cold and dark for all eternity is profoundly depressing." You might say that after this seminar, by the way, that would be fair enough. Simon Conway Morris: "A universe without an eschatological dimension is a universe that is incomplete, if not crippled." And Feuerbach: "The world has no value, no interest for Christians. The Christian thinks only of himself and of the salvation of his soul." Is Christianity actually more than that? I'm going to suggest to you that, of course, it is. However, these questions are not only the realm of philosophers and scientists and theologians, they're also the realm of popular culture. And I know this is a research seminar, but I couldn't just resist the temptation of showing you a short clip from a very profound philosophical series called The Simpsons. The situation here is that a comet has been discovered and is on its way to demolish Springfield. The town has had a public meeting about this comet and has decided to send up a rocket to intercept the comet. And this is what happens.
Will you all stop worrying about that stupid comet? It's going to be destroyed. Didn't you hear what the guy in the building said?
But Dad, don't you think...
Lisa, the whole reason we have elected officials is so we don't have to think all the time. Just like that rainforest scare a few years back. Our officials saw there was a problem and they fixed it, didn't they?
No, Dad, I don't think...
There's that word again.
What if this doesn't work?
Well, then I have a different plan. See? While while the unprepared are still sitting around twiddling their thumbs and going.
Dad, the plan.
I'm getting to that. So anyway, they're going.
Dad.
So anyway, we get in our car and take the bridge out of town. All the while, they're still going.
Dad, they're firing the rocket.
All right!
Look, the bridge. We're down.
It's times like this I wish I were a religious man.
It's all over, people. We don't have a prayer.
It's times like this that I wish I was a religious man. We come to questions about the end of the universe, and I'll describe some of the science of the accelerating universe in a moment, which is to a degree profoundly depressing. You might expect that theologians would have engaged with this at some depth, particularly as the 20th century has seen a renewal of eschatology, or theology of hope, in the work of Jürgen Moltmann, Wolfhard Pannenberg. Yet a lot of that theological work has not made connections with the physical universe and the future of the physical universe in itself. Of course, there are Christian movements who've speculated greatly about the future. The Left Behind series of books, launched in 1995, has sold over 40 million copies worldwide. I'll just repeat that for a moment. 40 million copies worldwide. Stephen Hawking's Brief History of Time sold 10 million copies worldwide. Part of what one commentator says has become America's favorite pastime, speculating about the millennium, or as another commentator puts it, the doom boom. Apocalyptic bestsellers, and how Jesus will take a group of believers through rapture. And this is a tendency which we've seen throughout the 20th century to combine biblical literalism, prophetic insight, numerology and special calling, and often confuses discussion of the resurrection and says that it's a rapture where people will be taken physically and then will follow a number of years of trial and tribulation before Jesus returns again. I think, however, underneath all of this, there are some very important theological questions for the science-religion dialogue. And that is how we respond to a number of areas of pessimism concerning the future of the world and indeed the universe, and what Christian hope says in the midst of that. Let me depress you in 4 areas, if I may. First of all, and I won't spend very much time on it because theologians have taken this seriously, but in the last few decades we've begun to respond to environmental problems of global resources, global pollution and global catastrophe. And what's been very welcome is the way that theologians increasingly have taken this seriously and talked about responsibility and stewardship and how that should lead to action. But there are 3 other areas about the future which go beyond planet atmospheric conditions, let's say. Second area is whether what happened to the dinosaurs might happen to us. This picture is of Jupiter, and you'll remember comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 in 1994. 21 fragments of the comet impacted the Jovian atmosphere, leaving these deep marks in the atmosphere. And it's thought that 65 million years ago a large comet or asteroid impacted the Earth, and this was in part responsible for the dinosaur extinction. There is a number of extinctions in Earth's history. Some people have argued for a cyclicity in this, and 1 or 2 argued that in fact there was a cyclicity which would be due to comet impact. My own feeling, for reasons that we worked on in the 1980s, is that to get a comet impact at more regular intervals than 250 million years is very difficult. However, there are over 2,000 asteroids which have orbits which cross the Earth's orbit, and some of these asteroids could cause terrific damage. We are involved at the moment in a program of charting the orbits of those comets, and people are beginning to think about how one would deal with a threat of an asteroid that was on a collision course. Of course, the real way to deal with such threats is to send Bruce Willis into space, and he would deal with it on our behalf. But there is serious scientific discussion on whether you could plant a little rocket on one of these asteroids and just nudge it out of course, rather than blast it to smithereens and then have to endure all the little bits falling on the Earth. Third area, let me move on, of scientific pessimism is the death of the sun itself. The sun is very successful at maintaining itself as a stable environment by nuclear fusion, taking hydrogen, transforming it into helium. Eventually it'll run out of the available hydrogen, and in a desperate attempt to keep going will start to swell up. The outer layers will absorb the orbit of the Earth, and we'll be fried when that happens. That will happen in about 4.5 billion years, so we're all right for dinner this evening. But nevertheless, people have begun to speculate about whether one could, at that stage, already be sending civilizations to other parts of the galaxy and finding other stars, terraforming planets, so that we can escape this threat. But the fourth area of pessimism will get us all eventually. And that is something that since 1998 has been somewhat unexpected within the cosmological community. If I'd been giving this talk some 10 years ago, I would have said to you that there are two scenarios for the end of the universe. If there's enough mass in the universe, eventually gravity will reverse the effects of the Big Bang expansion, and the universe will go back to a big crunch. And then I might have said, there's some speculative theories which will talk about a big bounce, an oscillation, and you get an oscillating universe rather like that. Or, if there's not enough mass, the universe will slow down in its expansion rate, but will expand forever. A number of groups in 1998, headed up by Saul Perlmutter and Brian Schmidt and Adam Rice, decided to try and find out just how quickly the universe was slowing down. What they needed to do in order to do this was to look at the universe on very large scales and have something that would give them distances on very large scales. And they found it in supernova explosions. These are the explosions of stars slightly larger than our own sun that are extremely bright, and a particular class of these supernova explosions. One believes that they explode at exactly the same brightness. Now that's very important, because if you measure the apparent brightness of a supernova explosion like this, and you compare it with what you think is its intrinsic brightness, that gives you the distance, and that's very important in astronomy. And so through different techniques of looking at these supernova explosions, they began to work out how the universe was slowing down, and to their complete surprise, the universe wasn't slowing down at all. It was speeding up. The accelerating universe, as Science magazine 1999 christened it. And that expansion has been confirmed in recent years through measurements from the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe, which is very difficult to say after the chocolate cheesecake you've had, which has looked at the microwave background radiation, in particular polarization and temperature differences in that. And that's confirmed the picture that the universe is accelerating in its expansion. And the reason for this is commonly called the dark energy. One of the very embarrassing things for astrophysicists is that we only know about 4% of what the universe is made of. 96% remains a mystery to us. 23% of it, or roughly roughly that is in the form of dark matter, a form of matter which we think we know what it may be, but we haven't any confirmation, and until the Large Hadron Collider starts working again, and we might be able to find it there, but maybe not. But 73% of the universe is in this dark energy. It's very difficult to know quite what this is, and then there's a number of theories on the market for it at the moment. Some will say that this is Einstein's cosmological constant, a vacuum energy, although there are difficulties of finding or making quantum theory work to give the kind of dark energy that we need on this. And there are others who say that this is due to some kind of scalar field. Those of you who've done a bit of cosmology, the type of thing that gives inflationary impetus in the early universe, a similar field to that. Well, some people have said that this dark energy actually isn't real at all. It's a discrepancy because general relativity doesn't work on the largest of scales. And even some have developed that and said that the discrepancy is there because the way that we deal with cosmological expansion assumes that the universe is homogeneous, smoothed out. In fact, it's very clumpy. And one or two people have said that it's because we approximate this clumpiness to a homogeneous universe, that's where the dark energy comes from. At the moment, no one quite knows. But what we do know is that the future of the universe is very different to that model of the universe collapsing. We think we're in this region here, where the universe will expand forever. One or two people have introduced a new force called quintessence, and part of the motivation for that, it seems to me, is to try and give the universe some hope of eventually collapsing. But nevertheless, I think we're in this area where the universe will expand forever. Well, you might say, well, that's pretty good, isn't it? At least we'll be all right beyond another 15 billion years or so. Well, not quite. I'm afraid as the universe expands, it cools, and as it increases in its expansion rate, it cools quicker. Eventually, energy is smeared out across the universe, stars turn into black holes, and the universe becomes a pretty cold and lifeless place. Pretty pessimistic heat death of the universe. The bang, not the bang, but the whimper. Scientists are optimists at heart, and so a number of scientists have tried to respond to this picture by giving different forms of optimism. Some have said, well, this universe destined to futility is okay because it's just one universe in many, many universes. There is an endless fertility of bubble universes, as John Polkinghorne would say, and therefore the demise of this universe is not too much of a big deal. Polkinghorne says, I quote, these scenarios present a scene of occasional islands of meaningfulness erupting with an ocean of absurdity. I don't find it terribly heartening to know that there's another universe somewhere which is going to be all right. Freeman Dyson, of course, did take the scenario seriously, Life in All Directions. He began to talk about what the future for life might be in a very cold universe, motivated by the sense that human technology has been able to do many, many things. What would happen if human technology was let loose for the next few billion years? And he extrapolated some form of artificial intelligence which would be able to maintain some form of life in the universe, suggesting that biological life would adapt first through genetic engineering to redesign organisms that could cope, and then consciousness could be transferred to new kinds of hardware, particularly a complex dust cloud, which would be able to survive in the ultra-low temperatures of a heat-death universe. He said life and intelligence are therefore potentially immortal. I don't know about you, but the prospect of being embodied in an interstellar dust cloud I don't find terribly hopeful. And of course, Dyson's model comes under severe difficulty with an accelerating universe, where structures, even dust clouds, become difficult to maintain. Frank Tipler is another scientist who's worked in this area in books such as The Physics of Immortality, again using that sense of what human intelligence might be able to do. It's interesting to me that this is a manifestation of what some theologians would call the myth of human progress. The belief that science and technology eventually will be able to bring about some kind of utopia, very popular at the turn of the 20th century, and yet illustrate time and time again that that confidence in human progress and technology may not deliver. Nevertheless, it's interesting to see. Alongside this, some other cosmologists have been very bold in recognizing the bleakness, the futility of the picture before us. Stephen Weinberg, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. And as a Christian theologian, how do I respond to this? And what can we say in the midst of this kind of scenario? Forgive me, I'm a Methodist. And therefore, let me go back to John Wesley for a moment. I'm conscious that Brian Beck is in the audience, so Brian, be gentle with me as I discuss Wesley. But what intrigues me about John Wesley in this context was that Wesley did something which gives us a clue, I think, to move forward in light of the future of the universe. Wesley, of course, read the science of his day very well. A number of books were influential, and he put it together with the New Testament account and began to think about the nature of new creation, new heaven and new earth. And that led him to some interesting conclusions. So in a famous 1781 sermon, The General Deliverance, Wesley talked about animal salvation. I'm interested by that because it gives a sense that Wesley's picture of the saving work of God is not just about individuals and human beings. It's about the whole of creation in some way. Much of our Western theology is dominated by Greek dualism and that sense of heaven as opposed to earth, or the soul being liberated from the body. I'm going to suggest to you that new creation is a much more profound and biblically solid foundation on which to begin to think about the future. Let me just take that theme of new creation and see how it might fold into some of these questions as we look at them. And I mean, the basis of this is shown in an exposition of some of these passages, the left-hand side of the screen. And I haven't got time to do that in detail with you today. Some of you may be very thankful for that. But the work, I think, does need to take the biblical passages seriously. I'll mention them along the way. Let me draw out some biblical themes, which I think, for me, are of theological importance. The first is the importance of the theme of new creation to the biblical accounts. So that in Revelation, in the midst of these apocalyptic pictures, that sense of God's purposes being about a new heaven and a new earth, not a liberation from this earth to a new heaven. The Christian hope is not about an otherworldly hope. Here the folk behind the Left Behind series, painting a picture of a kind of liberation from this earth, have got it somewhat wrong. And likewise, the eschatological scientists, Dyson and Tipler and others, who want to keep this creation as alive as possible for as long as possible, also don't see this sense that God's purposes are about new creation, not just the maintenance of this creation. Second biblical theme is that new creation is a possibility because of the Creator God. Within the passages that talk about new creation, in both Old Testament and New Testament, new creation is a possibility because God, the Creator of all things, still has purposes with this universe. And because he is creator, he can fashion new creation. So whatever the circumstances, creation is not limited to its own inherent possibilities. There is a creator God who is transcendent, and it's the action of this God that provides a basis for the future. And there is no sense of the myth of human progress here, of human beings being able to bring in new creation by themselves. And there's no sense of escapism or cyclicity. The sun will come out tomorrow, sings Annie. In fact, it won't always come out tomorrow. God's purposes are for new creation. Third, creation and new creation are mutually interdependent. So in Paul's letter to the Colossians, they seem to be mutually interdependent in the work of Jesus, creation and new creation. And that means that creation needs to be seen in the light of new creation, and new creation needs to be seen in the light of creation. A great deal of Christian theology, and may I say, a lot of the dialogue on science and the dialogue involving science and theology, does separate these things out. And we've done an awful lot of work on creation without seeing it in the light of new creation. Indeed, one might push it further, that if creation and new creation are mutually interdependent, there should be signs in this creation of new creation. And I think whatever Paul is actually meaning in Romans chapter 8, and the biblical commentators have written much on what he really means in Romans chapter 8, I think there is a sense that Paul is saying that there are pointers within this creation towards new creation. You remember the groaning image, the standing on tiptoe image in eager expectation of that which is to come. Creation is both necessary and points forward to new creation in the purposes of God. Fourth, the relationship between creation and new creation is one of transformation rather than annihilation and starting again. Now you might say, just hold on a moment, you've put 2 Peter 3:10-13 up there, which in a number of translations reads like this: "But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything in it will be burned up." Surely, you say, this is what Christians believe, that the universe will be completely destroyed, burned up. Richard Borkham, I think, has written helpfully on this particular passage, and he argues that the main influence behind this is Jewish apocalyptic. In contrast to the dissolving and renewing fire of the Stoics, Borkham argues that here the emphasis is on judgment. And he argues that the verse should be translated, "and the earth and everything in it will be laid bare, open to God's judgment." Borkham writes, "Such passages do emphasize discontinuity between the old and the new, but it is nevertheless clear that they intend to describe a renewal, not an abolition of creation." Fifth, and I've already mentioned it, and that is that this movement from creation to new creation does involve the theme of judgment, or as one commentator puts it, the getting rid of the bad. There's something very important that perhaps in Western culture we haven't represented in the theme of judgment. Sixth, God is at work in this transformation in both process and event. It seems to me that this is the importance of the parousia, the second coming of Jesus. However that will happen, and whenever that will happen, and don't be worried, I'm not going to prophesy the times or the seasons of that. The importance in the biblical account, I think, is that it's emphasizing that God is at work both in process and event. There is an inventiveness about God's interaction with the universe, alongside his sustaining of the universe and his work, if you like, behind the scenes. The second coming reminds us that biblical eschatology has a focus upon Jesus Christ. And the images used are suggestive of an event, which is in both space and time, and yet transcends space and time. Of course, within a concept of how God reveals himself in the universe, there is both process and event. The event supremely around the life, death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And I think a holding together of God working both in process and event is very important for us. Seventh, and you won't be surprised, key to this thinking is the concept of resurrection. As Paul would say, the resurrection of Jesus, as he talks about it in 1 Corinthians, becomes the first fruits of that which will happen to the whole of the universe. As he is my local bishop, I need to say, I hope you've read The Resurrection of the Son of God by Tom Wright. Tom, in this very long and careful book, argues that resurrection denied by pagans, affirmed by many Jews, is reaffirmed and redefined by Christians. But he argues very strongly for the sense of the resurrection being bodily resurrection, not resuscitation, but having a material quality to it. And why is that important? Well, it does mean that this creation is important. As Oliver O'Donovan said a number of years ago, the empty tomb is important because it talks about the transformation rather than the replacement of the body. That resurrection, I quote, is God's vindication of creation and our created life. God's purposes of the material world are that it should be transformed, not discarded. Resurrection also opposes the view that creation, this universe, is an end in itself. For if resurrection affirms creation, then it also points forward to new creation. The delight the other night in Durham of being present at the first C.K. Barrett inaugural lecture. Charles Kingsley Barrett, in his 90s, is still very active, both as a scholar and indeed as a preacher. And Barrett, a number of years ago, characterized Paul's view simply with the words, resurrection means transformation. And then, of course, the resurrection gives us a clue for holding together in this transformative process something about continuity and discontinuity. In fact, this point has been made over a number of years, that if we look at the relationship between the resurrected body of Jesus and the body of Jesus before the cross, then you see a degree of continuity. There are those things which mean that it's the same Jesus. There's the accounts within the gospel writers as they try to record these extraordinary events of this being the same Jesus. The marks of the nails, for example. The physicality of the eating of the fish. But there is at the same time discontinuity. This is a different Jesus. He appears in rooms with locked doors. And then on that story from Luke's Gospel of the road to Emmaus, where he walks for so long without the disciples recognizing who he is. I have to say to you, I've listened to a number of sermons which have tried to explain why the disciples didn't recognize him. Things like if you plot the sun from the road and they were walking into the sun and they didn't have sunglasses or their eyes were... I don't believe any of it, I'm afraid. I think what Luke is saying is that here was Jesus transformed. This wasn't exactly the same Jesus. It was only when he took the bread and he broke it that they discovered who he was. So if resurrection is marked by continuity and discontinuity, what might that mean for the transformation of creation to new creation? I think we begin to look at those areas of continuity and discontinuity. And maybe in questions, or if we had a little longer, we might want to begin to ask the question, what does that mean for the nature of space and time? Does that mean for the nature of matter? The Venerable Bede, whose tomb is just around the corner from my office, once asked the question, when the resurrected Jesus ate fish, what happened to the fish? That's not a bad question to ask, actually. What's the nature of matter? Doesn't mean that time is real in new creation, but no longer limiting in the way that we experience it here. Our experience of time in this creation is one where it's associated with decay. In new creation, might that be different? Tony Thistleton, in his very long commentary on 1 Corinthians, says the resurrection body is characterized by decay's reversal, that is, purposeful flourishing. Will time in new creation be characterized by purposeful flourishing? I could go on a little bit, but let me come back to a couple of things which I do want to say. If resurrection is important, and if it's the key to understanding the nature of transformation, then I think this is where hope stems from. A theme which Tom Wright in Surprised by Hope has explored, although, can we push it a bit further into the cosmic situation? That in the context of a universe which is, at a scientific level, seemingly destined to futility, Christian eschatology does give hope, because it talks about the transformation of this creation into new creation. One final theme, which I suggest we also need to give some attention to and work on, and that is the work of the Spirit in this transformation from creation to new creation. Christian theologians have tended to be very good in talking about the work of the Spirit as it transforms the individual believer, or indeed the church as a whole. But what's the work of the Spirit within creation? Pannenberg, you remember, wants to see the Spirit as giving cohesiveness to the universe. He uses field theory a little bit to try and model the work of the Spirit. I'm not overly convinced by that, I have to say. But that sense of the work of the Spirit giving cohesiveness to new creation seems to me to be important. Perhaps the Spirit is the ground and the redeemer of the relationality inherent in the universe. Salvation, as Richard Borkham comments, is both restorative, repairing the damage done by sin, and progressive, moving the work onto its completion. So therefore, can we see signs of the Spirit restoring damage and progressing God's work onto completion? Work of the Spirit. Well, what I've attempted to do is to just lay out some of the areas of scientific pessimism, particularly some of the work since 1998 as it relates to the end of the universe. I've tried to suggest to you that the central New Testament theme of new creation has much to say in that context, and try to draw out some of the themes which I think are important. I started with a quote from a footballer. Let me finish with another from Kevin Keegan. This was long before he was moved on from Newcastle for the third or fourth time. He said this in an interview: "I know what is around the corner, but I'm not sure where the corner is." Or Albert Einstein, who once wrote to a child anxious about the fate of the world, and he replied, "As for the question of the end of it, I advise wait and see." Well, we could say, well, we don't know what's around the corner. All of this speculation is rather meaningless. Yet, Martin Rees comments, "What happens in far future eons may seem blazingly irrelevant to the practicalities of our lives. But I don't think the cosmic context is entirely irrelevant to the way we perceive our earth and the fate of humans. I think Lord Rees is right that there is something of fundamental importance for us to, yes, speculate, yes, to think together about the far future, because what we do believe about the future does affect in some way how we live now. Jürgen Moltmann, commenting on the resurrection, said this: resurrection is a consolation in a life doomed to die. It's God's contradiction of suffering and death. Faith in the resurrection is the faith in God of lovers and the dying, the suffering and the grieving. It is the great hope which consoles us and gives us new courage. Dennis, let me finish there and give some time for questions and comments and criticism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Well, we've got a good time for questions, so over to you for questions and discussion. Let me ask the first question then. David, what do you think? I mean, in a sense, you started out with the physics and the cosmology and all that's very gloomy, and then we have the theological account. Would you want to try and join those accounts up in any way, shape or form, or simply leave them as two distinct accounts which have their own discourse and ways of thinking, and it would be unwise to try and fuse them? What do you think?
No, I do want to join them up, but I don't want to make them the same, so that the areas of overlap, the fruitful dialogue, are, I think, in the areas of the future of time and matter, questions that both physicists and theologians can begin to think about. Now, Bob Russell wants to go a bit further than this and actually say that theology should give some insights, some pointers towards science in this area. So, for instance, if we think that time should be about purposeful flourishing in new creation, how might we think about the nature of time? Could we think of multidimensional time, for example, as we think about multidimensional space? Would there be something about that? I mean, I'm cautious about that. I don't want to follow too far on that. But I think it's in those areas of the nature of matter, the nature of space and time, where some of these areas begin to overlap. And I think they do have their own discourses. But ultimately, if resurrection is about bodily resurrection, it is dealing with the stuff of the creation, then I think it's very important to begin the dialogue between these two accounts. And it's in those areas that one begins to see how that might happen.
Yes, yes.
You've spoken on the physical, scientific side of the end of the world in physical terms, as an event, if you like, in various possible views of what that might mean. In theology, you've tended to speak of the parousia, the eschaton, as an event. Would you have anything to say about the concept of realized eschatology?
For me, eschatology is not just about event, and that's the importance of process and event being held together. And realized eschatology, the sense of the kingdom now, I think is a very insightful way for understanding a lot of the New Testament. That this work of new creation doesn't simply come in with the parousia, that event in the far future when Jesus returns, but that the work of new creation stems out of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. But even in a sense before that, that in the purposes of God, creation and new creation go together, so that God's purposes focused in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. Nevertheless, we're always about creation and new creation. So actually, in one sense, I want to push realized eschatology even further back, to say that there is that sense of the unfolding of God's purposes, not just in the creation of this universe, but its eventual transformation But we see signs of the kingdom, particularly in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And we see them now. Now, coming back to Dennis's question, I think Christian theology has been quite good at looking for those signs of the kingdom within the individual believer, within the church, and within the church. There's an area where we need to think about what would be the signs of that kingdom within creation, the healing, the repairing, the transformation of creation now going on amongst us.
Here. Yes. Yes, please.
How does this fit with the idea of, say, a new heaven on earth, the coming of the kingdom of heaven, that is, the spread throughout the world of knowledge of God and transformation, maybe?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think you used the phrase heaven on earth, and that's a very interesting image within some of the biblical accounts. Not of us floating up to this ethereal heaven, but God himself being in the midst of the physicality of what we're all about. And therefore, yes, that's what I'm attempting to argue, that there is a much more integrated picture within the New Testament. That God's purposes are for the transformation of the material as well as the spiritual. God's purposes are for the whole. And that just as a resurrection for the individual believer, this is a resurrection of everything, not just our soul floating up to heaven. But biblical eschatology is about this sense of new creation, a new heaven and a new earth being transformed together.
Yeah, question in the back. Yes.
I'm just wondering if you think kind of that the phenomenon of human consciousness kind of offers any clues here, because it's clear that if we are to survive after death, there must be something more than kind of ordinary matter involved, because obviously ordinary matter is doomed to decay by the laws of thermodynamics.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it might be worth
Might be
a long conversation about that. Whatever the transformation of matter has to happen, we need to begin to think about how that happens. Now, it can't be that we're resurrected simply with the form of matter that we have at the moment. There is a decay within the universe which is going on. But matter itself has to be thought about in terms of its context, in terms of relationships as well. So that, I'd be intrigued just to think a little more about this. What does it mean to begin to think about how matter could be transformed? And that doesn't need to be that there are different kinds of atoms in new creation. It could be that the relationships between atoms are different. Now, I'm speculating here, but I think your point is valid, and we can think about it a little more.
Do you think, David, rather than thinking about atoms, thinking about information content is perhaps more helpful? That, I mean, information can be reconstituted in many different forms, and in a sense, consciousness is a form of information. So, is that perhaps a more helpful metaphor, at least, to help us speculate? I don't know.
It is, as long as we take matter seriously. Yeah, absolutely. I think the information content and the relationality of matter is very important. Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
It's a dark question. It follows on, I think, and I ask it as one who thinks he has seen a ghost. Could you fit ghosts into your alternative matter?
I don't know. May I broaden the question in order to avoid it? Because I don't know the answer. How do we deal not just with ghosts? I don't think I can deal with goats. How do we deal not just with ghosts, but with spiritual beings in general, the angels and the demons of the biblical accounts. And is there an overlap between creation and new creation? Now, I think this isn't an area, Brian, that I know very well at all. I'd have to bow to others. But there does seem to be an area of overlap between that which is to come and that which is. Quite how we characterise that, I don't know. So I don't know is the answer. What do you think? How do you understand ghosts?
I don't have any clear line on it at all. It just occurred to me as we're talking about the transformation of matter. There's a very persistent tradition of people seeing ghosts.
I think the only response or the hesitation I would have would be that it seems to me that the transformation is to that which is more than physical rather than less than physical. So that they.
Body of Jesus was visible.
Yes, I think so. And what I don't want to do is lose too much physicality into the kind of greyish, floating thing that goes around and is often confused with soul as well.
My ghost wasn't floating. My ghost was an actual person who looked across the lawn, but the gates were shut.
Right. And it wasn't a student late at night or anything.
And I'm totally puzzled as to what I
that's
saw.
what it was.
I'm quite self-sure I saw it.
Absolutely. Yeah, as long as it's not less than physical.
Right, yes, Colin.
Yes, could I just enjoyed your talk very much. When Jesus was resurrected, he needed some degree of physicality to interact with the world he was in. But if there's a new creation, then that may not necessarily be the case. But it may be the case. So do you think that Jesus in the new creation will be the same as the resurrected Jesus, essentially? And also people in the new creation will be the same as, similar in form to the resurrected Jesus?
Yes, I do. Although one of the motifs that one needs to also explore alongside resurrection is that of ascension. What does the ascension mean as we think about the physicality of Jesus? And Douglas Farrow, in a book called on Ascension recently, has begun to tease out those questions in a way that perhaps not many of us have thought about. I do think that there will be that continuity in new creation of us as individuals. There will be discontinuity too. And I think that image of Jesus' resurrection body being the first fruits of that which is to come is a very strong image. And therefore we have some confidence for saying, yes, it will be a Jesus who will be recognizable, and you and I will be recognizable. And you'll be able to say to me, well, you got all of those things wrong in that talk, Wilkinson, so many years ago. But there will be that sense of continuity. And I think there will be physicality, but it may not be as limiting for us, or as prone to decay, and as we have it here.
David, you mentioned this interesting sermon by John Wesley, and you didn't sort of follow up on the theme. I know it takes us into a slightly different area, but I mean, you mentioned the resurrection of animals.
Yes.
Now, it seems to me, if you resurrected all the animals that have ever lived, there's not going to be much room for us. I mean, it's incredible diversity and enormous numbers. I mean, what do you think about this? I know it's a bit speculative, but
I mean, a cosmologist thinks slightly different to a
I'm a biologist.
To a biologist, absolutely. And my immediate response, it's a very large universe to transform. And we've got 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies. There's an awful lot of room out there, Dennis, in one sense. And maybe that's the difference. However, your point is well taken. Let me take it seriously, and that is how much of this creation is transformed, and how much of the evolutionary process is transformed, and what provides historical continuity in new creation. So a good friend of mine is fascinated with whether we'll be able to talk to Augustine face to face, and at what level will Augustine be when we meet in new creation? How is history valued and yet transformed? And one could say the same thing about the evolutionary process with all of its waste and all of its dead ends, and a whole number of things. There's not only the breadth of species, but there's also the historical dimension of this. Do all biological species, are they all present in new creation or not? I don't know. But it's a big universe.
I've always wanted to ask my questions of the Apostle Paul. I'm hoping to have a sort of, all the things that we're never quite sure what he said. We could get a chance to get them clarified. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, question here, yes. Please. Yes. Yes, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
You began with the depressing aspect of the scientific account, albeit incomplete. But it seemed to me you responded with the account of new creation as being a response to that depression. That seemed to be inherent in what you were saying. Is that how you would like me to understand it?
That's certainly the way that I presented it. And I think that is one option for saying it, that in the light of scientific futility, Christianity gives eschatological hope, and there's something very positive about that. But I think, in many ways, the science-religion dialogue does allow science to question religious accounts and pose particular questions to religious accounts. And sometimes, within religious accounts, the science provokes a rediscovery of that which is already there. So, for example, one could say something on the lines that Christian theologians have got back into environmental responsibility, not because they read the Bible and discovered it there themselves, but because the environmental movement began to pose the questions, at which then the resources of Christian theology and scripture were rediscovered. I think the question of the futility of the physical universe pushes the question for Christian theologians: what do you understand to be God's purposes for the material world, for the physical world, in a way that sometimes we've just been able to neglect, we haven't really thought about a great deal. Once we do that, I think we discover in new creation a whole number of resources which actually begin to address this area in a, as you can see, a very small and initial way. But I think the resources are there to begin thinking a bit more constructively about it. So is it a response? Yes, it is. I think it pushes us back to rediscover some things that we as Christian theologians haven't given attention to. And I think that's the value of the science-religion dialogue, one of the values of the science-religion dialogue.
Good, well, thank you very much for that. And we've worked David really hard, and I think we want to thank him again for a really interesting seminar. So thank you very much.